The oldest industrial dynasty in America took itself apart in the summer of 2017, while the market climbed to record highs and nothing on the horizon suggested danger. The DuPont family had held their company since 1802, carrying it through the Civil War, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression without ever loosening their grip. But that summer, they broke a 215-year-old empire into pieces, on purpose. So why would a family that outlived every crisis in American history take itself apart in the one season none of them came? It was 1802, and a French refugee named Eleuthère-Irénée DuPont was building a gunpowder mill on the banks of the Brandywine River in Delaware. He had trained under Antoine Lavoisier, the chemist who effectively invented modern gunpowder production. When the French Revolution turned on his family, he sailed to the United States and bet everything on a single grim certainty. Nations at war need gunpowder, and the century ahead of him would offer no shortage of war. He was right. The War of 1812 brought the first wave of government contracts. The Civil War brought a flood. By the time the United States entered the First World War, DuPont was supplying close to 40% of the explosives used by the Allied side. The family that started with one mill on one river had become the powder behind American power. That kind of dominance does not go unnoticed for long. At its height, the scale did not really translate into modern terms. DuPont Enterprises, directly or indirectly, employed close to 10% of the population of the state of Delaware. That is not the largest employer in a state. That is something closer to the state itself. The family did not need to lobby Delaware to get what it wanted. They were the constituency. That dominance had already cost them once. In 1912, after a 5-year antitrust fight, a federal court forced DuPont to break up its explosives monopoly, spinning off 2 new competitors, Hercules and Atlas Powder, that operated as independent companies for decades. The family had felt the government reach into its business and carve off a piece before most American companies even existed. They would not forget the feeling. But gunpowder is only how the story starts. What kept the company alive for 200 years was a habit, learned the hard way, and repeated across generations. Products burn out, so do the structures built to hold them. The family survived by tearing down and rebuilding its own structure before anyone could do it for them. The habit that kept the company alive across 2 centuries would, a generation later, almost destroy it. The clearest example of it sits in the middle of the worst economic decade in modern history, when DuPont introduced neoprene, the first general-purpose synthetic rubber, in 1931. In 1938, the company announced nylon, and then spent $8 million building a plant in Cipher, Delaware to produce it. That single investment equaled roughly 1/6 of the company's entire net income for the year. They were betting 1/6 of their annual profit, in the depths of the Great Depression, on a material no consumer had ever heard of. It worked. Nylon went into stockings, then parachutes, then an entire family of synthetics that carried the company for the next 50 years. The dynasty that sold gunpowder to a young republic had quietly rebuilt itself into a chemistry empire. This is the pattern worth watching, not the products, the willingness to dismantle what the company is before being forced to. But the most expensive lesson came later, and the price of it is the largest number in this story. The scale of what the government would eventually take is what made the lesson permanent. Between 1917 and 1919, flush with First World War profits, DuPont had poured capital into a young and chaotic automobile company called General Motors. On the advice of financier John Raskob, the family acquired roughly 23% of General Motors for about $49 million, becoming its largest shareholder. When the automaker nearly collapsed in the post-war slump of 1920, Pierre DuPont took its presidency himself and ran it for 3 years, then chaired its board until 1928. For most of the decade, the family controlled General Motors from inside its own boardroom. It looked like the perfect integrated empire. It was also, in the eyes of the law, a problem waiting 30 years to be noticed. Here is the scale of what that problem cost. On the 3rd of June, 1957, the Supreme Court ruled that DuPont's ownership of General Motors stock violated antitrust law, not because of how they bought it, because of what it had grown into over 3 decades. The court ordered the family to give up the entire position. By the time the unwinding was finished, between 1962 and 1965, DuPont had been forced to distribute roughly 63 million shares of General Motors, worth around $3.5 billion. It was the largest forced divestiture since the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911.
But the dollar figure was not the part that reshaped how the family thought. That was buried in the fine print of the ruling. The court barred the family holding companies, Christiana Securities and Delaware Realty, from voting the General Motors stock during the unwind. It prohibited shared directors between the two companies. The government did not only take the asset, it took apart the entire structure the family had built to hold it. The scale was only half of the lesson. The timeline was the other half. DuPont had taken its position in 1918. The government did not file suit until 1949. The Supreme Court ruled against the family in 1957. By 1965, the last shares had left the family's hands. 47 years from purchase to final loss. That is enough time to learn a lesson. And this is a family that takes notes.
The deeper damage was not the money. It was that they never saw the rules close in around them. They had built a position legal when young and illegal when mature, and they had no say in the moment the regulator chose to strike. They did this because concentration looked like strength. They learned, at a cost of $3.5 billion, that concentration is exactly what regulators come for, and the timing of that visit is never theirs to choose. That is the price of waiting. But there was another family who never paid it because they moved first, and the scale of what they protected was even larger. An entire national industry.
In June of 1928, the Mellon family controlled Alcoa, the company that effectively was the American aluminum industry. There was a complication. Andrew Mellon was at that moment the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, which made a near monopoly held by his own family a politically radioactive thing to own outright. That month, Alcoa spun off its foreign operations into a new Canadian holding company called Aluminium Limited. Shareholders received 1 share of the new company for every 3 shares of Alcoa they held. The man placed in charge was Edward Davis, brother of Alcoa's president. The headquarters went to Montreal. On paper, it read like a routine reshuffle.
The calendar is what turns it into something else. Officially, the spin-off was about expanding into foreign markets. Unofficially, it moved a politically dangerous monopoly and its international dealings out of the United States. From Montreal, the new company could hold the family's foreign smelters and overseas contracts beyond the reach of an American court. Nothing about that summer demanded the move. The market sat near the top of one of the great bull runs in history. 16 months later came October 1929. By the time the crash and the long depression had finished tearing the financial world apart, the Mellon aluminum empire was already split into 2 structures in 2 countries under 2 sets of rules. The domestic business stayed home. The international half sat in Canada, beyond the immediate reach of American antitrust and tax pressure. This is not coincidence. One family learned the cost of waiting in a courtroom. Another sidestepped it entirely by moving while the sky was clear. And that brings the scale of the pattern to its final and largest demonstration, the one that played out in plain sight in our own decade. On the 31st of August, 2017, E.I. DuPont de Nemours & Company ceased to exist as an independent entity for the first time in 215 years. It merged with Dow Chemical in a deal valued at around $130 billion. To the market, it looked like 2 chemical giants combining for scale. But combining was never the goal. The merger was the setup for a split. The activist investor Nelson Peltz, through his fund Tryon, had been building a position since around 2013 and pushing publicly for a breakup since 2014. By the time of the deal, he was among the company's largest shareholders. The family did not fight him. They had seen what happens when a dynasty holds a concentrated empire too long, and they knew which side of this they wanted to stand on. DuPont announced its merger of equals in December of 2015.
Peltz had been in the stock demanding a breakup since 2014. Both descriptions of that deal are true. One of them simply reads better in a press release. The European Commission gave the merger conditional approval in March of 2017 on the condition that the companies sell off parts of the agriculture business to competitors. Regulators, in other words, helped accelerate the exact structure that the family had been quietly preparing for over the preceding 4 years. Now the split the entire merger had been built to allow could finally begin. It came in 2 deliberate stages. On the 1st of April, 2019, the group spun off Dow as a standalone materials science company. On the 1st of June, 2019, it spun off Corteva, the agriculture business, distributing 748,815,000 shares to shareholders, 1 share of Corteva for every 3 shares held. The same 1-to-3 ratio the Mellons used in 1928. What kept the DuPont name became a specialty products company with around $22.5 billion in revenue. The 3 pieces were deliberately uncorrelated. Material science moves with industrial cycles. Agriculture moves with food demand and weather, often against the industrial cycle. Specialty products track technology. When one falls, the other 2 are not falling with it. A family that had spent 2 centuries learning what kills concentrated wealth had rebuilt itself as 3 things that do not die at the same time. Lined up against each other, the 3 moves draw their own logic. $3.5 billion, taken by force in 1957. An entire national industry, quietly divided in 1928. A $130 billion empire, voluntarily broken into 3 in 2017. The pattern repeated at every scale. When a single concentrated position is spread across structures with different cycles and different regulators, no one ruling, crash, or political shift can take all of it at once, which answers the question the financial coverage never asked. Why do this in a calm market with no crisis in sight? Because the best moment to restructure is precisely when nothing is forcing the decision. In a crisis, a holder sells into weakness, on the regulator's timeline, at the market's worst prices. That is the lesson of 1957. In calm waters, a family restructures into strength on its own terms, while everyone else is watching the index instead of the filings. That is the lesson of 1928. Today, Dow, Corteva, and DuPont de Nemours trade separately on the New York Stock Exchange, each on its own cycle, each answering to its own regulators. The family trusts that once held a single concentrated position now hold pieces of 3 independent companies. The kind of concentration the Supreme Court attacked in 1957 no longer exists in any form a single ruling could unwind. That pressure has not gone anywhere. In August of 2024, a federal judge ruled that Google was an illegal monopoly in search, the first such ruling against a major technology company in a generation. The government asked the court to force Google to sell off its Chrome browser. The court stopped short, but the precedent now stands, and the Federal Trade Commission is pressing parallel cases, arguing that Amazon and Meta should be broken apart. The same regulatory machine that took DuPont's General Motors stake in 1957 is running again, pointed at a new generation of giants. Which raises the only question that matters now. When the next forced breakup comes, the families reading these filings already know which companies are quietly preparing to split themselves first. What DuPont did in 2017 is the part everyone can already see. The move that matters is the one happening right now, quietly, while the market looks the other way. Wealth Cipher reads the moves dynasties make long before the market sees the reason. 2 questions for the comments. Which of today's giants is quietly preparing to split itself first? If you hold one of them in your portfolio, which could a single ruling take apart tomorrow? Subscribe. The Cipher has always existed. Now you know where to look.